Do you remember your thought the night before you sat down to start writing the white paper?
Actually, I don't even remember what the exact day was. I was in San Francisco at the time. And I remember I had been thinking about Mastercoin at the time, and I had come up with on a few days before this with this concept called ultimate scripting, which was like sort of like a precursor to Ethereum, but the idea was that it would just sort of introduce a kind of arithmetic formula language to Mastercoin to make it just a bit more powerful. And at some point, there was this one day when in the morning I realized that, wait, if you just expand this just a step more, then it suddenly becomes much more powerful. And I, took this long 3-hour walk through, I think, the Presidio Gardens in San Francisco, and basically figured out at least all of the initial details.
Cool. How long did you spend sitting down and writing and editing that?
The initial version, I think, like 1 or 2 days, but then I sent that out. Then I got replies back, and then once I realized just how much interest there was, eventually I just sort of kept on expanding it, kept on sort of making it more and more complete, and then over the course of 1 to 2 weeks, it sort of balloons to around 30,000 words.
And you're asked to explain Ethereum to a developer that has never touched cryptocurrencies in a few sentences. How do you go about it?
So, actually one of my favorite descriptions of Ethereum that I've seen lately is PHP in the sky. So, it's this kind of programming language where, you don't really need to care where it is, you don't need to care who's running it, but, it just runs and you can trust that it is going to run. So, yeah.
Bitcoin has political and monetary activism inherent in its code.
Yeah.
What's the driver behind the development of Ethereum?
Interesting question. Originally I just came up with this. I saw these people working on these protocols that were just unleashing. Seemed like they were going to unleash so much possibility, and I just came up with this one particular way of improving them, and that's it seems to me immediately like this was something that a lot of people would find useful. Although at the time I was kind of afraid that there was some kind of weird cryptographic reason why it wasn't viable at all. And for the first 2 weeks, I just expected to get an email coming from someone basically telling me that. Eventually didn't, and eventually sort of more people just started showing up. And so, I don't think there was any sort of one particular motivation behind the whole thing. And as far as political views go, I think I've definitely sort of more pragmatic in some ways than I was 2 years ago, though I'm definitely not the same as people like Blythe Masters and so forth. It's and blockchains in general, it's important to note that no technology really is fully politically neutral, and everything has some values to it. And if you do believe, they're fundamentally about individual empowerment, and if you think that individual empowerment is a bad idea, then you probably should not like blockchains, and you probably should want to try to destroy them by any means possible. But at the same time, it is a very big tent, and I'm actually really happy to see how you have all sorts of libertarian capitalists, basic income advocates, just regular people interested in things like whether it's crowdfunding or voting or whatever else, and they're all building applications, and they're all sort of taking their own different paths to improving the world.
Over the past 5 days, the talk in the room has been Microsoft, private chains, banks. Not the only talk in the room, but it definitely occupied most of my hearing spaces. Are you afraid that 10 years down the road, Ethereum will get corporatized?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's that I think that one of the things that you might have noticed with the blockchain crypto space in general in the past sort of 1.5 to 2 years is that people have rapidly sort of caught on to this meme that you can partner with a large organization and make yourself look massively credible because, to a naive person, company X is working with JP Morgan sounds incredible, but the reality is that, if mega corporations have 100 times more employees than smaller corporations, which makes them 100 times more impressive, but it also means that they have 100 times more people with which they could just throw a few at every single project and to make sure that they cover absolutely everything. So that's, I think there's definitely some of that in the Ethereum space as well. There's the perception that people see these partnerships as being very impressive, and so people like kind of putting them front and center because that's how they convince people that this is actually real and it's not just a bunch of crazies. So whether or not that's there's a risk of sort of Ethereum becoming corrupted in some sense. It depends what you mean by Ethereum, I suppose, because I think one of the really important properties of this code is the fact that it's this decentralized thing that, that's not controlled by any one group, and there is a strong consensus that it's not supposed to be controlled by any one group. And on some level, even when I talk to some of these corporations, they kind of recognize that that's why people are interested. So that, do I think there's some risk that at some point, the sort of the Ethereum Foundation or whatever body ends up having the most social capital is going to be taken over by a bunch of banking bodies that put in mandatory KYC? Actually, I think the probability there is pretty low. You could argue that there are sort of opportunities for corruption on the margins, like, if some group has $100,000 to spare, is it going to spend it on privacy enhancing software, or is it going to spend it on, even faster high frequency trading, settlement clearing?
Bitcoin had the Lehman Brothers meltdown in 2008.
Yes.
So it's not so much about individual empowerment, but we're getting there. In 2010, there was the WikiLeaks blockade. This is what brought the first real rise of Bitcoin because of individual empowerment. Then came the Silk Road, again, individual empowerment. Then came Cyprus and the state taking a bail-in out of the middle-class deposits, again, possibly individual. What do you think will be the case, the global case, that Ethereum will be set up to be the alternative for individual empowerment? Or do you think that's not the case with Ethereum?
I think Ethereum definitely empowers individuals to do a lot of things. Bitcoin is this sort of cross-border currency, and it makes it very easy for small groups of people that are potentially international to move money between each other. With Ethereum, you could imagine people creating entire corporations that are kind of run on the blockchain. I think people also talk about this as being a kind of framework for trust, and the concept of kind of a low-cost framework of trust is, I think, by itself sort of strongly in that direction, because right now, I think one of the reasons why we have large institutions to the extent that we do is because they are trusted. People know the brands, and it's a lot easier for people to kind of get behind that as opposed to getting behind some service made by a few people in their basements that could end up working well or could end up breaking and stealing all their money. So with the things like smart contracts, you actually have the ability for people, basically 15-year-olds in their basements, to create services that you can mathematically prove are exactly as trustworthy as stuff that's being put out by JP Morgan. And that is empowering for the 15-year-old.
Say Bitcoin suffered lack of money that went to development, which was then covered by the Bitcoin Foundation. It was an organization that was created after the fact to try and address a problem.
Yes.
And that didn't work. There was a real big failure for Bitcoin that left really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Ethereum, on the other hand, decided to create the foundation before the launch, or just about. And not being part of Ethereum and just reading the Reddit and the Twitter feeds, I know that there's been a lot of internal politics of people going in and out of Ethereum. So it's definitely something that is very needed to have some sort of a foundation that everyone agrees with. That being said, there is also a problem with centralization of nodes and mining within Ethereum. Do you think these are the two main problems that could undermine Ethereum, or do you see something like a bug in the system or something that could come in later? What do you think?
I mean, yeah, Ethereum is definitely taking a different path in its evolution than Bitcoin did. I mean, on some degree, you know, the start was more centralized, and on some level that was a good thing. You know, there was a foundation. The foundation had 30,000 Bitcoins. It managed to pay for a huge amount of developments to get to just sort of force the ecosystems to like jump all the way to roughly where Bitcoin was back in 2012 or 2013. So now, of course, the question is, how is this going to continue evolving in the future? And, you know, is there going to be a strong foundation in the middle? What exactly are there going to be other foundations? What exactly are particular organizations going to be doing? How is governance going to be done? How's funding going to be done? Those are definitely open questions, and I think we've seen how, you know, Bitcoin's definitely been having huge problems in trying to figure that out as well, and I'm sure we're going to start seeing some of those issues ourselves. But, you know, on some level, it's kind of hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. Stuff that could be a threat to the ecosystem. I mean, in general, you know, just about everywhere there's this sort of chronic problem that public goods are underfunded, and pretty much no one has been able to come up with any kind of consistent solution, you know, other than just having governments run around and take for 30% of people's money. And I have a feeling it's going to be a while before governments agree to take percentages of people's money to pay for cryptocurrency technology development, so that's kind of not going to happen. So I mean, one of the sort of arguments that some people make is because we have this concept of DAOs and, you know, you have things like token issuance and so forth, that it offers some kind of novel opportunities for people to do things without, to kind of mitigate the problem that weren't really available before. And that's definitely an area that's kind of worth experimenting in. As far as other technical problems, forks could happen. Any kind of sort of critical software bugs could happen. Those are, I think, they're kind of wild cards. It's really hard to predict the probability there.
Who's funding development for Ethereum?
Who's funding development? Well, right now up until now, it's been mostly the foundation. And the foundation, you know, it's got its income basically by selling Ether. And so from now on, I mean, the foundation still has funding, and the foundation still is continuing to fund, you know, the Go clients, some of the other clients, and some research. But increasingly, we are kind of seeing people employed by other organizations also sort of take part. So in the long term, I mean, it could turn into something closer to the Bitcoin model, where you just have developers paid by companies, and it's some combination of Microsoft, whatever other groups, you know, Augur, you know, hopefully a few startups, but it's hard to tell. In practice, I think one of the sort of important discoveries that I've personally made over the past couple of years is it's also just important not to kind of formalize things too much, because in a lot of these cases, especially with research, you know, most of the people who sort of contribute to Ethereum research do so just because they love Ethereum and they just want to work together. And it's not even clear that establishing any kind of formal structure around that is even going to be beneficial at all. So it's, in some cases, it's more, I mean, it's not just a matter of sort of funneling money to the right sources, it's also just the sort of question of people. And fortunately, you know, in a lot of places this question is actually easier.
Do you think it's like a conflict of interest, though, if a corporate sponsor does?
It is, and on some level, in small ecosystems, conflicts of interest are inevitable. So, I think in general, one of these sort of other problems that both sort of centralized companies and just about every ecosystem has, I think there's different kinds of values that are more important for small organizations and different kinds of values that are more important for large organizations. So I think issues like preventing conflicts, I think in very small organizations in practice it pretty much always takes second place to expediency, and it probably should. But in larger organizations, that becomes a larger problem because you're not in an environment where everyone trusts everyone else anymore. And the question is, can you actually manage that transition well?
Thank you so much, Vitalik. Well.
And Charles just wanted to come and talk about, or just give a general musing